The drive had been interminable, the last 30 miles nothing but a winding, overgrown track that clawed its way through a forest so dense it seemed to swallow the light. My hands, usually steady and precise, guiding a fine-tipped brush or a delicate scraper, had gripped the steering wheel with an almost bone-aching tension. Not from fear, not exactly, but from the sheer anticipation of the task ahead. This was more than an inheritance, it was an undertaking, a monumental challenge to my meticulous nature. I preferred the quiet solitude of my workshop, the scent of linseed oil and aged wood, the predictable rhythm of restoration. Each antique, a puzzle of decay and forgotten beauty, yielded to patient hands and an exacting eye. This manor, however, promised something entirely different. It was less a puzzle and more a crumbling monument to neglect. The forest finally receded, spitting me out onto a desolate, cobbled drive. And there it stood. A hulking silhouette against a bruised, late-afternoon sky. The manor house. It wasn't just old, it was ancient, a beast of blackened stone and sagging timbers, draped in ivy that looked less like a decorative flourish and more like a desperate, grasping embrace. Windows, many boarded, others shattered, stared out like vacant eyes. The slate roof sagged in places, a broken smile, and the grand oak doors, once surely magnificent, were scarred and weather-beaten, a testament to decades of unchecked exposure. A profound silence descended as I cut the engine, broken only by the whisper of wind through skeletal branches and the distant, mournful cry of a crow. The air itself felt thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else, a faint, metallic tang, like old blood or forgotten iron. My gaze swept over the facade, assessing the sheer scale of the work. The stonework alone would require months, perhaps years, of careful repointing. This wasn't just a restoration, it was a resurrection. I unlatched the gate, its rusted hinges protesting with a shriek that echoed unnervingly. Each step on the overgrown path crunched with dead foliage. The closer I got, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It felt less like approaching a building and more like entering the maw of some slumbering, gargantuan creature. Reaching the immense front doors, I pulled the heavy, tarnished brass knocker. It produced a dull, resonant thud that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the house, a hollow, echoing sound that died slowly in the oppressive quiet. No response, of course. The legal firm had sent the keys weeks ago. Just as I inserted it, a sudden, disorienting shift occurred. The world tilted. The musty scent of decay vanished, replaced by a sharp, sterile tang. My vision blurred, then sharpened, momentarily replacing the grand, decaying entryway with a stark, fluorescent-lit corridor. The dull thud of the knocker was replaced by the low, insistent hum of a generator, a rhythmic thrumming deep beneath the floor. I saw bare, utilitarian walls, pale green and chipped, a heavy steel door with a small, reinforced window. A tremor ran through me, a profound sense of dislocation, of being utterly out of place, out of time. Then, just as swiftly, it dissolved. The hum faded, the sterile air retreated. The manor's weathered door was back, the heavy key still in my hand, the metallic tang of old iron replacing the antiseptic. What was that? A trick of the light? Exhaustion playing havoc with my senses? I shook my head, pushing the bizarre hallucination aside. It was just the strain, I told myself. The sheer weight of this inheritance. With a deliberate twist, I turned the key. The ancient mechanism groaned, a sound like a tortured sigh, and the bolt reluctantly withdrew. I pushed. The air inside was stale, heavy, a stagnant pool of forgotten decades. Moonlight, filtering through a grimy skylight high above, illuminated dancing motes of dust in the gloom. Cobwebs, thick and gray, festooned every corner, draping over skeletal furniture like funereal shrouds. The faint, metallic scent I'd noticed outside was stronger now, mixed with the pervasive smell of mildew and dry rot. My bootfalls echoed loudly on the checkered marble floor as I stepped inside, the sound swallowed quickly by the vastness. To my left, a series of closed doors, their paint peeling like sunburnt skin. The scale of the place was overwhelming. This wasn't just a house, it was a mausoleum. I drew my breath, forcing down the unease that prickled at the back of my neck. My hand instinctively went to the small toolkit I always carried, a familiar weight against my hip. This was going to be a monumental project. As an antique restorer, I understood that beneath layers of grime and decay often lay astonishing beauty. Something that wasn't beautiful, and certainly wasn't meant to be unearthed. The first few days were a blur of organized chaos. I started with the study, a room whose heavy oak paneling and dust-shrouded bookshelves promised both a challenge and a rewarding transformation. My tools, arranged with surgical precision on a drop cloth, gleamed under the temporary work lights I'd strung up. Each antique piece, a silent testament to forgotten hands, called out for my touch. I began with the large mahogany desk, its surface scarred by a century of ink spills and hurried movements. My process was methodical. First, a gentle cleaning to remove the accumulated grime, revealing the wood's original grain. Then, careful assessment of damage, planning the repairs. I'd set my favorite chisel, a slender, razor-sharp instrument I'd inherited from my mentor, on the corner of the desk. Turned to fetch a small pot of beeswax polish from my kit. When I turned back, it wasn't there. A small frown creased my brow. I wasn't prone to misplacing things. My workspace was a sacred grid. I scanned the desk, the floor around it, my toolkit. Nothing. A faint prickle of irritation, a tiny burr on the smooth surface of my concentration. I sighed, rummaging through the larger case, pulling out a backup. It was an inconvenience, nothing more. The missing chisel, I told myself, would turn up. Probably kicked it under the desk without realizing. The hours bled into each other, marked only by the shifting light outside the grimy windows. The house was quiet. Too quiet, sometimes. A profound, echoing silence that seemed to absorb the gentle scrape of my sandpaper, the soft thwip of my polishing cloth. Every now and then, a floorboard would groan upstairs, or a distant draft would make the old timbers sigh. I dismissed them as the natural settling of an ancient structure. But then, the sounds became less natural. A faint scratching, like mouse claws on plaster, but from within the walls themselves, rather than the attic. It would start, stop, then start again, always just beyond the reach of my full attention. I'd pause, hold my breath, and it would vanish. When I resumed work, it would return, a barely perceptible skitter that frayed the edges of my focus. One afternoon, I was meticulously applying a dark stain to a restored drawer front. The power flickered. Not just a dimming, but a complete, sudden cut. My breath hitched. Something metallic and antiseptic, utterly out of place in the ancient study. My eyes, struggling to adjust, began to piece together the vague outlines of the room. But it wasn't the study I saw. The heavy oak paneling was gone, replaced by stark, gray concrete walls. Fluorescent light fixtures, shattered and sparking, hung precariously from a low ceiling. There were no windows, only a single, reinforced door with a small, barred viewport. The familiar scent of wood and polish vanished, overwhelmed by that metallic, sterile tang, now laced with something acrid, like stale sweat and fear. My heart began to beat a frantic rhythm against my ribs. My hands, still holding the small rag with the wood stain, started to tremble. This wasn't the manor. This was an intake holding area during power outage. The label formed unbidden in my mind, stark and terrifying. I could almost hear the muffled, frantic murmurs of unseen occupants behind the concrete walls, the distant clanging of unseen equipment. Then, as suddenly as it had vanished, the power surged back. The work lights blazed, blinding me for a split second. When my vision cleared, the concrete walls dissolved, the steel table vanished. I was back in the dusty, wood-paneled study, the scent of polish and old timber filling my nostrils. The mahogany desk was before me, exactly as it had been. That's what it had to be. I was alone here, after all. The isolation was getting to me. But the unease had taken root. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves against the windows, became amplified, imbued with a new, sinister weight. Later that evening, after a meager dinner of tinned soup, I returned to the study to tidy up. My gaze fell upon the large, antique globe that stood in a corner, its brass stand tarnished, its paper map faded and peeling. I hadn't touched it. Yet, it was subtly different. One of the small, delicate brass finials that capped its meridian ring, which I distinctly remembered being loose and tilted when I first surveyed the room, was now perfectly upright, gleaming faintly as if recently polished. And beneath the globe, tucked neatly into the base, was my missing chisel. The one I'd been so sure I'd misplaced. It lay there, sharp and undeniably present, a silent accusation. It felt too real, too deliberately placed. I hadn't put it there. No one else was here. The house wasn't just old and creaky. It was aware. And it was playing with me. I wasn't alone. Not really. The quiet wasn't empty, it was waiting. And I had a terrible, dawning suspicion that whatever was watching, whatever was moving my things, wasn't just observing. It was learning. It was beginning to know me. The air, thick with the scent of old wood, settled dust, and something vaguely metallic, seemed to hum with a forgotten silence. My initial task was to meticulously clean and assess the oak paneling that lined the walls. Each section required careful attention, a gentle brush, and a keen eye for any sign of rot or damage. I loved this part of the work, the quiet communion with the craftsmanship of generations past. My fingers traced the intricate carvings, feeling the smooth, worn grain beneath the accumulated grime. It was during this meditative process, running my hand along a particularly ornate section near the grand, defunct fireplace, that I felt a subtle give. Not a loose panel, but something more deliberate. A faint click, almost imperceptible over the creak of the old house settling around me. I pressed again, experimenting with different points along the seam. The wood, dark and unyielding everywhere else, seemed to yield just slightly under my thumb in one specific spot, directly behind a carved lion's head. A faint, almost imperceptible groove appeared, a hairline fracture in the otherwise seamless facade. My heart gave a little jolt, the thrill of discovery. This was precisely the kind of architectural secret I'd anticipated. With a fine-bladed probe, I carefully worked the edge, the wood groaning softly in protest. Behind it lay not a hidden passage, but a shallow cavity, barely deep enough to conceal a small, leather-bound book. The book was ancient, its cover cracked and dry, the spine barely holding together. A single, tarnished brass clasp, green with age, held it shut. I carefully unlatched it, the metal groaning like a sigh. Inside, the pages were brittle, yellowed, and covered in a spidery, looping script that seemed to shift and blur before my eyes. The ink, faded to a sepia tone, smelled faintly of mildew and something else, something I couldn't quite place, like dry earth mixed with a hint of burnt sugar. It wasn't a diary, not in the traditional sense. The early entries spoke of local folk tales, of the land itself, of a thinning between worlds. There were repeated mentions of a specific date, a recurring celestial alignment. Ceasing to be, not dying. Dissolving from memory. Leaving only an absence that no one could quite explain. This wasn't history as I knew it, it was something far older, far more unsettling. I was so engrossed, my brow furrowed, trying to decipher a particularly dense passage about the veil drawing thin at the old wellspring, when a sudden, sickening lurch seized me. The room, the book, the musty air, all of it dissolved in a jarring flash. One moment, I was hunched over the journal, the next, I was somewhere else entirely. There were other people, indistinct figures, hunched and silent, their faces obscured by the pulsing gloom. A heavy, bolted door stood opposite me, scarred and painted a uniform, depressing gray. A low, guttural hum vibrated through the floor. My name. What was my name? The thought felt slippery, just out of reach. Then, as abruptly as it began, it ended. I blinked, hard. My hands were still clutching the decaying journal. The smell of old wood and dust was back. What was that? A hallucination? A vivid daydream? My mind felt fuzzy, like waking from a deep sleep and not quite knowing where you are. It felt like a memory, yet it felt utterly alien. Must be the stress, I told myself, the isolation. Inheriting a crumbling manor, taking on a project of this magnitude, it was bound to take its toll. My focus had been so absolute these past few days, perhaps I was simply overtired, my mind playing tricks. But as I looked back down at the journal, the unsettling scrawl about the slow erosion of names and faces seemed to pulse with a new, terrifying relevance. A shiver, unrelated to the draft from the old fireplace, traced its way down my spine. Something in this house, or perhaps in my own mind, had just shifted. But the meticulous work, usually a balm for my mind, felt different. An undercurrent of unease rippled beneath my focus. The silence of the manor wasn't peaceful, it was watchful. My curiosity, a professional hazard, began to itch. The study, with its floor-to-ceiling shelves, seemed like the natural place to begin a different kind of restoration, that of the manor's forgotten narrative. I set aside the polishing cloths and started systematically examining the books, not for their titles, but for any hidden compartments or loose pages. The leather-bound volumes were mostly academic texts, dry historical accounts, and forgotten poetry. But behind a particularly heavy tome on medieval architecture, my fingers brushed against a shallow recess in the oak. It wasn't a secret passage, merely a small, dust-caked wooden box. Inside, nestled amongst brittle lace and a desiccated rose, were several handwritten journals and loose, yellowed newspaper clippings. The script in the journals was spidery, almost illegible in places, detailing mundane household expenses alongside increasingly frantic entries about the encroaching fog and the whispers in the stone. The newspaper fragments, mostly undated and torn, spoke of local disappearances, not sensationalized headlines. Small, almost apologetic notices tucked away in the back pages. Local farmer, Mr. That night, the dreams started. Not the usual jumble of daily anxieties, but vivid, almost corporeal experiences. A voice, muffled and indistinct, kept asking me questions I couldn't answer. Your name, it echoed. Couldn't grasp. Where are you from? The question hung in the stale air. I searched my mind. There was only a vast, echoing emptiness where memories should have been. Panic clotted my throat, but my voice wouldn't come. The following days blurred, not with organized chaos, but with a growing sense of disorientation. The details of the manor's past, fragmented as they were, had opened a door. Now, the entity seemed to be walking through it. When I turned, there was nothing, only the still, heavy air. I'd pause, straining to hear, but they would always recede just beyond the threshold of understanding. The memory gaps were the most terrifying. I'd set a chisel down, turned to retrieve a piece of sandpaper, and when I looked back, the chisel was gone. I'd search frantically, only to find it minutes later, precisely where I'd left it, as if I'd simply blinked and forgotten its presence. One afternoon, I spent an hour painstakingly sanding a section of a window frame, only to realize, with a jolt of ice in my veins, that I had no recollection of starting the task. My hands ached, fine sawdust coated my sleeves, but the memory of the work itself was a blank. I started leaving notes for myself, small yellow stickies on the workbench, finish sanding architrave, check hinges on south window. But sometimes, I'd find notes I didn't remember writing. Notes with instructions that made no sense. Remember the name, one read, in my own hand. I had no idea what name it referred to. The lines began to blur. Was the manor truly afflicted, or was I? Was the ancient entity real, or was the isolation, the sheer scale of the task, finally cracking my meticulous mind? I started to question everything, even the very purpose that had brought me to this decaying house. The first sensation was the cold. It wasn't the crisp, biting chill of the manor house, but a deep, penetrating dampness that seeped into my bones, a kind of cold that felt ancient and forgotten. My eyes fluttered open, struggling against a profound disorientation. The last thing I remembered, I was in the study, my tools gleaming under the temporary work lights, the scent of old wood and dust of familiar comfort. Now. This. I was lying on a thin, stiff cot, the mattress smelling faintly of something chemical and stale. I pushed myself up, my muscles aching in protest, my head throbbing with a dull, insistent ache. Where? My voice sounded alien, thin, and reedy. This was not the manor. The ceiling was low, crisscrossed with exposed pipes that dripped occasionally, each drop a sharp, resonant plink that echoed too loudly. A heavy, bolted door, scarred and industrial, dominated one wall. There were no windows, only a small, grimy grate high up near the ceiling, letting in a sliver of faint, gray light that seemed to mock the dimness within. The phrase materialized in my mind, not as a memory I recalled, but as a label instantly, horrifyingly, known. How could I know that? I was Reed. I was an antique restorer. I was restoring the manor. The study. The heavy oak paneling. The dust. My tools. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to grasp onto those solid details, those anchors of my identity. But they felt distant, like photographs viewed through cloudy glass. I stumbled off the cot, my legs unsteady. I reached out, my hand brushing against the wall. The surface was clammy, rough, unforgiving. This was real. But how did I get here? A flicker in my peripheral vision. I spun around. Nothing. Was I alone? The muffled voices, the distant clang of metal, the hum of machinery? There was nothing but my own ragged breathing in that incessant drip. Hello? I called out, my voice cracking. It was a pathetic sound, swallowed instantly by the vast, empty space the room seemed to contain despite its small size. It wasn't a human voice, not exactly. It snaked into my ears, not with words, but with a feeling. A feeling of profound wrongness. A sense that I was forgetting something vital. I pressed my hands against my temples, trying to force clarity into my fractured mind. Reed. My name is Reed. I specialized in period furniture, intricate carvings, the slow, painstaking resurrection of beauty from decay. I remembered the scent of beeswax polish, the delicate scrape of a chisel, the satisfying click of a perfectly fitted dovetail joint. These memories were strong, vibrant. But the last few days, the manor. They were dissolving. The whisper intensified, now closer, seeming to emanate from the very concrete walls. It was a chorus of faint, indistinct voices, a cacophony of forgotten names, lost faces, fragmented moments. It felt like my own memories, or what should be my own memories, were being played back to me, distorted, corrupted. Who are you, really? The thought wasn't mine. I stumbled backward, hitting the cot. I'm Reed. I shouted, the defiance a desperate attempt to assert myself. I'm Reed. A memory. Sharp and vivid, suddenly flashed before my eyes. I was standing in front of a mirror in the manor, my reflection looking pale and haggard. The lines around my eyes deeper than I remembered. But then, the reflection shifted. It wasn't me anymore. And his eyes. His eyes were mine. The image vanished, leaving me gasping, clutching at my chest. Was that a memory, or something planted? The entity. It fed on memory, on identity. This was it, wasn't it? This was its attack. In that moment of near-total blackness, I felt it. A presence. Not a physical touch, but an immense, suffocating weight pressing down on me, an invisible force that sought to flatten me, to erase me. I closed my eyes, trying to conjure the image of my workbench, the familiar grain of a mahogany chest, anything solid. But the images were weak, dissolving at the edges. You are borrowed. You are empty. My knees buckled. The words burrowed into my mind, each one a tiny chisel chipping away at my core. Was I borrowed? Was I empty? The thought was terrifying, not just because it was a lie, but because a part of me, a small, terrified part, almost believed it. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling. Were these my hands? The calluses, the faint scars from years of restoration work. They were there. but they felt detached, alien. I flexed my fingers, trying to reconnect with them, with myself. Then, I noticed it. A small, swirling symbol, like an ancient, indecipherable knot. I had never seen it before. It wasn't a scar. This mark. Was it a brand? A signature? My sense of self, already frayed, threatened to unravel completely. Wasn't I? Borrowed? Empty? The words echoed in the sudden, cavernous silence of the manor. My own voice, when I tried to speak, felt thin, like tissue paper. No, that was a lie. A cruel, insidious lie. I wasn't borrowed. I was Reed. I had a life, a history, a past filled with dust and varnish and the satisfying click of a perfectly mended hinge. But the certainty, usually a bedrock beneath my feet, felt like shifting sand. A part of me, a tiny, insidious tremor deep inside, wondered if it wasn't a lie. That was the truly terrifying part. I scrambled backward until the cold, rough concrete wall of where? This wasn't the library anymore. It was just a wall. Concrete. My hand went to my chest, feeling for the frantic drum of my heart. It was there, a desperate bird in a cage, but the beat felt. No. This was its doing. The entity. It was trying to break me, to unravel me from the inside out. But I wouldn't let it. Not yet. Not while there was still a shred of Reed left to fight. I had to get out. That was it. Simple. Irrefutable. Get out, get help, tell someone. Tell. Who? The estate agent? My colleague, who always teased me about my meticulous nature. The thought of explaining this to anyone felt like trying to describe a dream in a language no one understood. I pushed myself to my feet, my knees still shaky. The air felt heavy, thick with something metallic and stale, like old pennies left in a damp drawer. I stumbled through what I thought was the main hall. My breath hitched. This wasn't right. Nothing was right. I made for the front door, the solid oak barrier that had been my entry point into this nightmare. I reached for the heavy brass knob, my fingers fumbling. It wasn't there. There was just a smooth, unyielding expanse of what looked like painted drywall. No seam, no frame, no knob. Just a flat, blank surface where the door should have been. I ran my hands over the wall, frantically searching for an outline, a latch, anything. Nothing. The windows. I could break a window. There were dozens of them, tall and elegant, lining the main floor. I lunged towards the nearest one, a desperate surge of adrenaline coursing through me. My hand slammed against the glass, or where the glass should have been. It was solid brick. Not brick behind the glass, but brick instead of the glass. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. Renovation? No, I'd been here for weeks. I would have noticed. This was impossible. I needed to call someone. My phone. Where was my phone? I must have left it somewhere. My office, perhaps, or the kitchen. I started moving, half stumbling, half running through the manor's shifting interior. Corridors I remembered as long and straight now seemed to loop back on themselves, leading me to rooms I didn't recognize. I pushed open a heavy, unmarked door, expecting to find a pantry or a storage room. Instead, I was met with an abrupt shift in environment. The ornate, decaying grandeur of the manor dissolved, replaced by a stark, utilitarian space. The floor was rough, unpolished concrete. The walls were painted a sickly institutional green, peeling in places. This wasn't the manor. This wasn't anywhere I recognized. Where am I? I muttered, spinning slowly, trying to orient myself. This was a corridor, narrow and claustrophobic. Doors lined both sides, heavy and made of plain steel, each with a small, smudged window and a stenciled number. A low hum vibrated through the floor, a resonant thrum that seemed to burrow into my bones. Then, the single bulb above me sputtered, flickered violently, and died. The hum was still there, a deeper, more menacing rumble now. I stood frozen, my eyes wide, useless in the sudden, absolute blackness. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs. A faint, sickly green glow emanated from somewhere down the corridor. An emergency light, I realized, still struggling to comprehend this sudden, jarring transition. I stumbled towards it, my hands outstretched, scraping against the rough walls. The light led me to a larger, open room. This was it, the source of the hum. The emergency lights here were stronger, casting a sickly, uneven illumination over a space filled with rows of empty, bolted-down metal chairs, a long counter with a scarred laminate top, and various pieces of heavy, inert machinery, mostly covered in tarpaulins, but their bulk still evident. How could I have walked from the manor into this? My eyes, still adjusting, scanned the counter. And there, lying face up amidst a scattering of dust and forgotten forms, was a clipboard. I walked towards it, my footsteps echoing unnervingly in the vast, empty space. My fingers trembled as I picked it up. The top sheet was a printed form, a subject intake record. And at the very top, in bold, stark lettering, was a name. Read. My own name. Below it, fields for origin, prior residence, identifying marks. And beneath each of those, not my manor address, not my birthmark, not my family history. Just a series of vague, almost poetic phrases. Origin, fabricated, for purpose * prior residence, temporary construct, dissolved. Identifying marks, none truly indelible. My vision blurred. But the words remained, stark and undeniable. My name, staring back at me, above a description that stripped away everything I thought I was. I wasn't just borrowed. I was fabricated. The thought was a chisel, yes, but this was a sledgehammer, shattering the last fragments of my identity. I was empty. The entity hadn't just taken my memories, it had made me. My vision blurred. But the words remained, stark and undeniable. I wasn't just borrowed. I was fabricated. The stark, clinical script beneath it seemed to mock my very existence. The air was thick with the scent of stale disinfectant and damp concrete, a smell that clung to the back of my throat. Emergency lights, powered by a sputtering generator somewhere far off, cast an anemic, flickering glow, making the shadows writhe in the corners of the small room. The bare metal table before me felt cold beneath my fingertips, as did the flimsy document I clutched. This couldn't be right. My memories, fragmented as they were, felt real. My life, messy and imperfect, had been mine. Hadn't it? I forced my eyes back to the page, my breath catching in my chest. The document was old, brittle, its edges yellowed. It detailed not a person, but a construct, a carefully orchestrated sequence of memories and personality traits designed to fulfill a specific purpose. My purpose. It spoke of a lure, a conduit, a vessel. Each word was a hammer blow against the fragile edifice of my self-identity. The text elaborated on the entity. It wasn't some beast of tooth and claw, but something far more insidious. Its origins were described as prehistorical, phonic, a force that had festered beneath the manor for millennia, older than the stones themselves. It didn't seek to end life, but to erase it, leaving behind only an empty shell, a husk of what once was. It devoured the unique tapestry of experiences, beliefs, and personal history that made an individual whole. And it did so by first sowing confusion, then doubt, then outright delusion. It didn't just take memories, it replaced them, weaving intricate, convincing falsehoods until the victim could no longer discern truth from fabrication. The borrowed memories I'd struggled with, the strange sense of unreality, it was all part of its insidious process. Preparing me for what? My gaze dropped to a section marked Appeasement Protocol. The flickering light made the words dance, but their meaning was brutally clear. The entity, the document explained, could not be destroyed by conventional means. It was a fundamental force, a wound in reality itself. It could only be sated, its hunger temporarily dulled. And the price. The price was absolute. It required a complete, willing surrender of a fully formed identity. Not just life, but the deliberate, conscious dissolution of self. It wasn't enough to die, one had to cease to be in the most profound sense, offering up the entire edifice of one's mind as a conscious sacrifice. And the document hinted that a fabricated identity, one specifically designed for this purpose, was the most potent offering. The most delicious. My own existence, every fragmented memory, every fleeting thought, every impulse, had been meticulously constructed. I wasn't born, I was built. Built to be this offering. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. My life wasn't a journey, it was a carefully plotted trajectory towards this single, horrific end. The manor, its ancient stones humming with an unseen presence. And me, Reed, the antique restorer, the man who loved old things and forgotten histories, the man who was himself a forgotten history, a meticulously crafted lie. My hands trembled, but a strange, grim determination began to solidify within me. But I was Reed. Or at least, I had been. And if my existence was a fabrication, then perhaps my end could be my own. The price was everything. My very self. And I knew, with a horrifying certainty, that I would have to pay it. I wasn't just borrowed. I was fabricated. The stark, ugly truth, written in a hand that felt both familiar and utterly alien, twisted my gut. Fabricated. A construct. A lie. It wasn't just my memories being eroded, it was the very foundation of my existence. The emergency lights, sputtering fitfully, cast long, wavering shadows that danced like mocking spirits. I could hear the distant, rhythmic groan of unseen machinery, a mechanical heartbeat that seemed to echo the frantic thrumming in my chest.
Each flicker of the light threatened to plunge the space into absolute blackness, and with it, the last shreds of my own understanding.
The paper, thin and brittle beneath my fingers, felt cold, despite the clammy heat of my palm. I opened my eyes again, forcing myself to reread the damning passage. It detailed my creation, a meticulous account of implanted memories, curated experiences, and a manufactured past. It spoke of a purpose, a function I was designed to fulfill.
Designed. Not born. Not grown.
A laugh, raw and broken, tore from my throat.
It didn't sound like me. Nothing sounded like me anymore.
I was an antique, restored and then dismantled, piece by piece, until the original object was lost entirely. If I was fabricated, if my identity was a construct, then perhaps that was also its weakness. It consumed what was real, what was lived.
But what if it consumed something else? Something designed to break it?
My mind, though fractured, still retained a frantic, desperate logic. I was an antique restorer. My entire life, or what I thought was my life, had been about understanding the intricate layers of an object, identifying its true form beneath centuries of decay and false additions. This entity was doing the opposite. It was decaying me, adding false layers until I was unrecognizable. The air was heavy, stagnant, tasting of dust and something metallic. I dragged a hand across my face, feeling the rough stubble, the clammy skin. My own reflection, when I caught it in a grimy, scratched pane of glass on a defunct control panel, was a stranger's. Gaunt, wild-eyed, a haunted echo of the man I used to be. The entity thrived on the erosion of truth. It blurred the lines, manufactured delusion. So, what if I gave it a delusion so potent, so complex, that it choked on it? What if I didn't try to reclaim my identity, but rather, created a new one, specifically designed as a trap? The idea was terrifying in its simplicity, horrifying in its implications. To build a new identity, a fortress of fabricated memories, so intricate and self-contained that the entity would get lost within it, consumed by its own feast. But to do so, I would have to consciously sever the last, fragile threads connecting me to whatever original self I might have possessed. It would be a final, deliberate act of self-erasure. A sacrifice of my very essence. The reveal hit me then, a chilling whisper in the echoing space. The entity didn't just consume. It absorbed. It incorporated the identities it devoured, adding them to its own monstrous, ever-growing tapestry. That's why the manor felt so old, so burdened with countless lives. It wasn't just taking, it was becoming. And if it could become me, then perhaps I could force it to become something else. Something it couldn't control. My plan began to solidify, grim and absolute. The cost? Everything. The last flicker of the original Reed, if he ever existed, would have to be extinguished. I would have to commit to this new, manufactured identity so completely that I might never find my way back. Or worse, the entity might consume the trap, and then consume the trapmaker, leaving nothing but a husk. But what other choice did I have? No. If I was to be erased, I would do it on my own terms. I would go out not with a whimper, but with a desperate, self-destructive bang. I ran a trembling hand over the rough concrete of the wall. The distant groaning of machinery seemed to quicken its pace, a pulse beating out the limited time I had. Not physical structures, not antique furniture, but a world within my own crumbling mind.
A world designed to kill. The first step was clear: I needed to anchor it. A core memory, entirely false, yet utterly convincing. Something to draw it in. I closed my eyes, picturing the manor, not as it was, but as a place of infinite possibilities, a stage for a grand, final deception. My mind, a battlefield, would become a forge. And I, the last, desperate architect, would build my own tomb, hoping it would become the entity's instead. The sacrifice would be absolute. My resolve, tragically, was equally so. The ugly truth, scrawled in that alien familiar hand, still burned behind my eyes. Fabricated. A lie. A construct. It wasn't just my memories that had been borrowed, it was me. The world, which had already been tilting, now spun on a new, horrifying axis. But in that dizzying chaos, something else ignited, a cold, hard ember of defiance. If I was a construct, then I could choose what I was constructed of. I could choose to be Reed. My plan, whispered to myself in the echoing silence of the manor, felt both insane and utterly vital. I had to make myself real, not by discovering some lost truth, but by forging one. The world around me dissolved, not with a flash or a bang, but with a slow, creeping erosion of definition. The sturdy oak of the manor's library faded into a gray, indistinct blur, the scent of aged paper replaced by something metallic and stale. It was a vast, cavernous space, colder than any crypt. Rows of empty metal shelves, like skeletal ribs, stretched into the gloom, their surfaces slick with condensation. This was where identities were processed, perhaps. I gripped the small, tarnished silver locket I'd found in the manor's oldest wing, a tiny, innocuous thing that felt impossibly heavy in my palm. It was my anchor. It had no intrinsic power, I knew. Its power was what I gave it. It was a symbol of the truth I would forge. I am Reed, I stated, my voice surprisingly steady, though it felt swallowed by the vastness. The emergency lights flickered violently, plunging the area into momentary, absolute blackness before sputtering back to a sickly orange glow. My memories began to unravel. Not just fade, but actively distort. My mother's laugh, once warm and familiar, became a harsh, mocking cackle. The workbench in my restoration studio, a place of comfort and purpose, transformed into a sterile, featureless slab, devoid of tools. Your sorrow, all carefully placed, all fabricated. A wave of nausea washed over me. The very ground seemed to shift beneath my feet. I saw myself, a younger me, playing in a sun-drenched garden, but the grass was plastic, the flowers paper, and the sun a harsh, artificial lamp. It was a stage. My entire life, a meticulously constructed set. The entity wasn't just showing me my memories, it was re-editing them, proving its dominion. My mind reeled. What if every cherished moment, every foundational experience, was merely a program running its course? The locket in my hand felt suddenly insignificant, a trinket against an ocean of manufactured reality. Then, I remembered the feeling of restoring a chipped porcelain doll, the meticulous care, the slow, satisfying process of piecing together fragments, of bringing something broken back to a semblance of its original beauty. That feeling was mine. The frustration, the triumph, the quiet dedication, that wasn't a script. That was an experience. No, I growled, my voice raw. Even if the pieces were given to me, I chose how to assemble them. I chose the care.
I chose the passion. The entity responded with a furious, silent roar that vibrated through my bones. The air crackled. The metal shelves around me began to shudder, rattling violently, as if an invisible force was trying to tear them from their moorings. Images flashed before my eyes, faces of colleagues, fleeting smiles, the warmth of a shared meal, all of them twisted, contorted, their expressions morphing into grotesque masks of accusation and malice. "They know you're a fraud," the entity hissed. "They know you're not real." My head throbbed. My legs felt weak. I wanted to curl up, to surrender to the crushing weight of its truth. I focused on its weight, its cool silver against my skin. A new realization dawned, stark and terrifying, yet empowering. The entity didn't just feed on memory, it fed on the acceptance of those memories as absolute truth. If I acknowledged their fabrication, if I chose to define myself despite them, I denied it its sustenance. I am Reed. I stood there, trembling, exhausted, but with the locket pressed against my chest, a new, fragile core of self-knowledge forming within me. I was fabricated, yes. But I was also chosen. I had chosen myself. The drip, drip, drip of water was the only sound now, a slow, rhythmic pulse in the void. I stood there, trembling, exhausted, but what? My breath hitched, a ragged sound in the profound blackness. My body ached, a deep, pervasive thrum that resonated in my bones. I was alive. Had I won? The concept of victory felt alien, a word without a definition. What had I even been fighting? There was a blankness, a terrifying expanse where memories should have been. The confrontation, the entity, the manor itself, it was all a swirling vortex of fragmented images and sensations, none of them solid. It felt familiar, like a well-worn stone, but also distant, as if I were speaking of a stranger. Was it mine? Nothing. Just a vague sense of a man, tired, with lines around his eyes. Whose eyes? Whose lines? I knew that. The words were a solid anchor in a sea of confusion. But why was I here? The purpose of the place, the context, had evaporated. I felt lighter. Not in a good way, not a sense of release, but as if a significant portion of my being had simply been scooped out, leaving an empty cavity. Memories, precious and mundane, moments of joy and sorrow, faces of people I must have known, they were gone. Not just forgotten, but erased. The entity had fed, just as I'd feared. It had consumed the very essence of who I was, leaving only a skeletal frame behind. I pushed off the wall, my legs unsteady beneath me. Each step was a deliberate act of will, a struggle against an invisible current. I reached out, my fingers brushing against unseen surfaces. Cold metal, then rough concrete, then something that felt like a thick, grimy pane of glass. A window? To what? This wasn't just exhaustion. This was a fundamental fracture. The image was a blur, the scent a ghost. My work, the meticulous craft of antique restoration, the tools, the specific glues, the delicate touch required. It was all there, the knowledge of it, but the passion, the memory of doing it, of being that person, was gone. It was like reading a textbook about a life I hadn't lived. It listened, it waited. Was the thing truly gone? I stumbled forward, my hand scraping against something sharp.
A jolt of pain, real and immediate, cut through the fog. I brought my hand to my face, sniffing. Blood. The coppery tang was a bizarre comfort, a tangible sign of my own physical existence. But the cut itself meant nothing. I couldn't remember how I'd gotten it, or even if it was a fresh wound or an old scar I'd forgotten. A faint, greenish glow pulsed once, far down a corridor I hadn't noticed before, then vanished. Hope, a dangerous, fragile thing, flickered. Light. An exit. But what would I find when I stepped into that light? Would I recognize the world? Would the world recognize me? The lingering scars weren't just on my body, they were etched into the very fabric of my mind, a terrifying tapestry of what was missing. I was a man without a past, a name without a story. I had one, but the cost was everything. Had it worked? Had it truly gone? A weak, yellow beam of light, thin as a thread, snaked under the bolted door. Footsteps, heavy and urgent, approached. Voices, muffled but distinct, called out. Hope, a fragile, unfamiliar thing, flickered. When the heavy steel door finally crashed open, the sudden rush of cool, fresh air was almost as shocking as the bright, blinding glare of a handheld lamp. A burly security officer, his face creased with concern, stood framed in the opening, his companion just behind him. Reed? Are you all right? The security officer asked, his voice booming in the confined space. I blinked, trying to adjust, my tongue thick and clumsy. It's Dawn, I managed, the words catching in my throat. The manor. It's quiet now. They helped me out, guiding me through the flickering emergency lights of the abandoned factory complex. I remember the detective asking me questions, his brow furrowed, his pen poised over a notepad. I tried to explain, to articulate the horror, the entity that fed on identity, the battle for my own mind. He listened patiently, nodding, but his eyes held a pity that stung more than any disbelief. They spoke of stress, of trauma, of the isolation of the manor. I didn't argue. What was the point? I left the manor behind, sold it without a second thought to a developer who saw only potential luxury apartments, not a gaping wound in time. I bought a small, unassuming house far from the coast, nestled in a quiet, inland town where the biggest excitement was the weekly farmers' market. I needed normalcy, a blank canvas. To repaint my life. I found work at a local antique shop, a small, dusty place where the biggest challenge was differentiating between mahogany and rosewood. It was simple, familiar, comforting. The nightmares faded, replaced by dreamless sleep. My appetite returned. I started to remember things, not just the manor, but my childhood, old friends, the scent of my grandmother's kitchen. It was like retrieving scattered pieces of a mosaic, painstakingly reassembling them. My identity, I thought, was slowly solidifying, becoming whole again. But then, subtle shifts began. I started noticing details others missed. A faint etching on a tarnished silver locket that told a story of forgotten love, a barely perceptible crack in a porcelain doll that hinted at a violent past. I didn't just see the object, I felt its history, its emotional imprint, as if the memories were tangible, edible things. I saw, not with my eyes, but with an inner sense, a flash of a woman's face, her eyes wide with fear, hiding something precious within the chest. Then, another image, a child's small, trembling hand reaching inside. These weren't my memories, yet they felt intimately familiar,
like distant relatives I'd never met but inherently understood.
This wasn't just empathy, it was something more. A hungry curiosity. A deep, abiding satisfaction in absorbing these fragments of lives.
Later that day, a colleague, a kind, elderly woman with spectacles perched on her nose, brought me a chipped ceramic vase to repair. She began telling me about her grandson, his struggles with school, her worries about his future. It was as if I could reach out and pluck those emotions, those memories, right from her mind. And the thought, fleeting but undeniable, was that I wanted to. I dismissed it, of course.
Trauma, lingering effects. My mind playing tricks. But the feeling persisted.
A growing, insatiable hunger for stories, for experiences, for the very essence of others' lives. One evening, alone in my quiet house, I sat in front of a mirror. My reflection stared back, the lines around my eyes a little deeper, my hair a little grayer.
But something else was there too.
A certain intensity in my gaze, a depth that hadn't been there before.
My pupils seemed to dilate just a fraction when I focused, as if seeking something just beyond the surface. But what if that emptiness wasn't its departure?
What if it was just
transfer? The entity hadn't been defeated.
It hadn't been banished. It had simply found a new host.
A more resilient one.
One that had fought it so intimately, so fiercely, that it had inadvertently absorbed its very nature.
My victory was a lie.
A manufactured delusion. I leaned closer to the mirror, my breath fogging the glass. When it cleared, I saw not just Reed, the meticulous antique restorer, but something else shimmering beneath the surface. A quiet, patient hunger.
The manor had been its prison, its feeding ground. Now, I was both. And the truly horrifying part?
Only a profound, unsettling peace. A quiet, pervasive satisfaction.
It had just moved inside of me.